Hi everyone, thanks for coming. We're just about to get going. We're just going to be counted in for our online audience and then we will get going. Hello and welcome everyone. Great to see so many of you here in person and watching online for this Onward event on behaviour change and the transition to net zero. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ed Burkitt and I'm Head of Energy and Climate here at Onwards. And for those of you who don't know Onwards, well done for finding us. We're a relatively new centre-right think tank dedicated to boosting economic opportunity and strengthening communities in all parts of the UK. Before we get going, I want to say thanks, a huge thank you to our 4 speakers for joining us and also to Imperial College London for supporting us to host this event. We're here today to talk about behaviour change and the transition to net zero. Net zero will require wholesale changes by individuals and communities at a similar pace to the society-wide adoption of previous technologies, such as the internet and cars. We're also going to have to switch to low carbon energy sources, improve the energy efficiencies of our homes and offices, and adopt less carbon intensive forms of transport and eating. To date, much of the policy focus has been on top-down government initiatives and fiscal incentives. However, many of the net zero technologies that we're now asking people to adopt offer few obvious advantages, and in some cases are more expensive and disruptive to adopt, at least for now. So that raises some key questions about what incentives will be the most effective to encourage adoption of new technologies and to encourage people to change their behaviours, especially at the scale and urgency that's required for net zero. So four key questions from me to hopefully frame this discussion. What areas of net zero require behaviour changes by individuals rather than just by big companies? Is it right for the government to try to change people's behaviour to achieve net zero? Is there any overlap between behaviour change for net zero and achieving other policy aims like cleaner air, healthier eating, less congestion, and where is there conflict? And finally, what behaviour change policies are likely to be the most effective, and is there good evidence for that? We have a terrific panel with us today to get stuck into those questions. On the end here, we have Professor Frank Kelly, who is Chair of Community, Health and Policy at Imperial College London. His work spans all aspects of air pollution research, from toxicology to science policy, and he's been very influential in developing policies, particularly in London, in relation to the ultra-low emission zone. Also joined by Councillor Marissa Heath, the CEO of the Plant-Based Food Alliance and the Cabinet Member for Environment at Surrey County Council, where she is responsible for the Council's Climate Change Delivery Plan. On my right, I have the Right Honourable Philip Dunn, MP, the Member of Parliament for Ludlow, and the Chair of the Environmental Audit Committee. And finally, Andrew Shine, Senior Advisor in the Behavioural Insights team, where he oversees the team's work on decarbonisation, energy and water efficiency. Before we get going, a quick note on format. We'll start with an introduction from each member of the panel, followed by a panel discussion, and then finally, we'll have a Q&A with our virtual and physical audiences. If you're watching in the room, I'll ask you to raise your hand at the appropriate time. And if you're on Zoom, you can use the Q&A function and the questions will be fed to the panel. So let's kick off. So I'll start with Philip first. How do you tackle this question of behaviour change and net zero?
Well, thank you, Ed, and thank you for inviting me to join your panel today. So our committee runs the sort of whole gamut of holding the government to account across the environment, across government departments, frankly, across governments. We don't specifically scrutinise the devolved assemblies in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but we can look across the public sector at local authorities and even private companies. We try to hold it to account from time to time, particularly where we encounter egregious behaviour. And our role is really in addressing government policies, implementation of those policies, but we're increasingly looking now at the impact that those have on corporates, on other public bodies. So we routinely scrutinise what each government department is doing. We sort of do one a year towards helping achieve the government's net zero Britain ambition. But more and more, our work is looking at the impact on consumers that these policies are having. And I suppose the sort of indirect route to that, and you touched on this in your introduction, is through the extent to which government is providing the frameworks by which decision makers in corporates and other bodies can adapt their behaviour in order to meet these ambitions. And my sense in particular from COP26 and the work in the run-up to that and at the event was that corporates are now running ahead of governments around the world. I think that's the case in many, not in every sector, but it's very much accelerating the pace at which corporate boardrooms are getting the message, much of it influenced by the investor community. And our committee has been quite at the fairly early stage in pointing out to trustees of pension funds, in particular, is where we started, but the investment community in the City of London, where we have, you know, a European-wide, if not global, lead in setting policy and strategies for investors, that they're increasingly demanding from the boards in whom they're investing, the companies where they're investing, a better understanding of what they're doing to meet their environmental commitments. So I think that we're now starting to see that leading to activities by corporates which are helping to frame choices for consumers about what they decide to do. So we're getting to consumers sort of further down the food chain, if you like, in the work that we're doing. And we'll come on to talk about this, I'm sure, but many of the reports that we produce as a result of inquiries that we're doing are starting to get to, well, what is the practical impact for consumers? What are the choices they're having to make? And to what extent does government support, carrots or sticks, help to influence those behaviours?
Okay, great. Marissa.
Thank you for inviting me to speak. So at Surrey County Council, we've set the objective of becoming carbon neutral as an authority by 2030, but also as a county by 2050, and that means the whole of the county, which is pretty ambitious. And the only way we will do that is through our residents' behaviour change. So it's something we're really thinking about. And local authorities, I think, are really well placed to do this work because they understand their public, the residents living within their constituencies. They often get down to working with different groups, particularly those in vulnerable, low income, different residents groups, and you have climate change activist groups that have formed within there that can also help with this work, but they're not very experienced in doing behaviour change kind of work. So it's a hugely challenging thing facing us. If I just speak for one moment about plant-based as well, behaviour changes, I mean, diet to me is the elephant in the room. People aren't talking about it enough. And at the county council, we're talking about transport, about changing energy uses in people's homes and things, but actually diet's the low-hanging fruit because people can make those individual choices themselves. And it's not about an all or nothing, and it's not about sort of saying you must be dictatorial in what you say people should eat, but it is, again, about that behaviour change and the education focus on it. And when I think of successful campaigns that we've done around behaviour change, the government in particular, I guess I think about smoking, drink driving, seatbelts, all really hard-hitting campaigns which really changed how people operated and chose to do things. But that approach is probably not the right approach to take with climate change, because the evidence has been shown over the last couple of years around COVID that when people get very anxious, particularly younger people, children, very much so, it becomes quite overwhelming to them. And we as a local authority can't go around sort of instilling fear into people. We've got to encourage and incentivise them and show them the best ways to go forward on making those changes. So we need to be positive about what we do as a local authority and create this kind of message of abundance using things like our countryside. In Surrey, we've got absolutely masses of beautiful areas, A and B in there and things. So how can we use that as the tool to drive forward behaviour change? How can we create local food? How can we get people involved in what farmers are doing? How can we get them to understand the needs for biodiversity, all of that kind of thing. Just looking briefly, as I was a couple of weeks ago, around the sort of tools for behaviour change, it mentions everywhere motivation, capability and opportunity. So around motivation, within the local authority, we're looking at money saving, for example. Everyone's really worried about their energy bills at the moment. So we're talking to them, we're using the hook of conserving energy. How can you insulate your house? How can you use your boiler better, as Andrew may talk about later? Then we're also using things like social prescribing and mental health, again, relating back to the countryside to get people engaged in what we're doing. Those are the tools we're trying to do. And with the Plant-Based Food Alliance, again, you use those same tools. Is it about health? Is diabetes a concern? Are you overweight? Is heart health an issue? Those sorts of things, to try and encourage positive thinking around these sorts of changes and things. And I just had a look at what we're doing in Surrey in regards to capability. We've been sort of mapping out where we can help people and where we can create that capability. So electric bikes, we're trying to look at where we can put them in where people can access them, but also allowing free trials, so that those who perhaps aren't, on incomes where they can afford these kind of things can get a chance of trialing them out, and then we can look at how we can make them affordable to use. Same with car clubs. Same with what we're doing around food initiatives. In our county, one of the initiatives is local food kitchens, where we create food for those who are struggling at the moment. And I will put the funding into that as an elected member. So it's up to me to also encourage that food to be healthy and sustainable at the same time, and make sure I'm sort of capturing that in what I'm thinking, because that's a positive thing that influences people. Lots of things going on around creating opportunities as well that will help behaviour change. So we're offering incentives for business through a scheme called LOCAS, where you give £10,000 to businesses to be able to put into change into greener use. And that will then make them think, what could that 10 grand be the seed for that I can build upon, and how can I create more green thinking in what I'm doing? Same with what we're doing with residents in terms of giving them seed money to change energy if they're on low incomes under £30,000. We're trying to sort of create this positivity around what we're doing. So our climate change behavioural messaging is very much about, this can be a good thing for you. It doesn't just have to be a sort of scary, overwhelming thing. That's the approach we're coming in on. I'm happy to speak more about it as we get to questions.
Great, hope to pick that up as we get to questions. So Andrew.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting us. So I want to talk a little bit about the IPCC's latest report. They were really positive about behavior change. They noted that sociocultural changes can offer gigaton scale CO2 savings and represent a substantial overlooked strategy. We thought this was really positive, and as a behavior change practitioner, it was really fantastic to see the new emphasis. And it sort of mirrors some of the UK's CCC's modeling. They note that 62% of emissions reductions depend on behavior change. And of that, 9% comes from curtailment and substitution behaviors. So that's about diets, but also driving less, changing aviation patterns, reduce energy use. But 53% relates to technology adoption behaviors. So that's heat pumps, EVs, solar, and those are big behavior challenges themselves. When you think about that 53%, you realize that the behavior change that's required is not just about new, previously untapped solutions that we can just slot into the model and give us some more carbon budget. Instead, you could frame them as an extra hurdle and complication that applies to the whole endeavor. For example, aversion to new technologies, status quo bias, could slow down adoption curves. Frictions and hassles and present bias might mean people don't retrofit their homes, even when it makes economic sense to do so. And we know that retrofitting homes is a really important part of heat pump readiness. And perhaps most importantly, most people will replace their boilers when they've broken, and they need replacing quickly, as Marissa found out 2 weeks ago. And that means that they don't upgrade to a heat pump, which can take a lot longer to install. And that locks them into another 15 years of fossil fuel consumption. I don't want to be pessimistic. It's just that the point is that behavior change is enmeshed into the whole endeavor. So the question is, how do we achieve that behavior change that we need? And how does it work at scale? We think of behavior change as being analogous to swimming in a stream. Agency and choice are important, but the stream has its own current. And right now, making sustainable choices often is like swimming upstream, whether we're talking about EVs or heat pumps or consuming less meat, using less flights. What I mean by that is it's often the difficult choice. It's often the more expensive choice. It's often not the norm, and it's rarely the default. So our message is we can't just implore and educate people to swim harder. We also ideally would change the current of the stream itself, or in the language of behavior change the choice environment. And that needs strong institutional leadership. At the behavioral science 101 level, a good mnemonic to start with, in our opinion, is to go east. What we mean by that is that behavior should be easy, attractive, social, and timely. So on making things easy, I'll take these each in turn. We think time of use tariffs should basically be the default. That'd be a really interesting way to enable more demand response on the energy network. On making things attractive, we think governments could be really smart about designing incentives in an attractive way. For example, with plastic and glass bottle return schemes, instead of paying 10 pence per bottle returned, we could have lotteries giving perhaps £100,000 for every millionth bottle returned. We think that the rough calculations on that mean that you could have 35 winners a day, and people would be much more likely to participate, giving the life-changing sum on offer. On making things social, we all know intuitively that we follow the crowd and use the social environment to infer what's normal, what's safe, sensible, and appropriate. Simply telling people that they use more energy than their neighbors reliably reduces consumption by 1 to 3%. And that's also why we have green number plates on electric vehicles, so other drivers start to understand that they're normal. Really good evidence shows that solar panel installations are contagious too. So we wonder, could we do likewise with other pro-social and pro-environmental behaviors that are currently somewhat invisible, like home retrofits and heat pump installations? Could we improve house signage or have heat pump ready status on property listings, maybe show home networks to increase the salience and perceived normality of heat pumps? On timeliness, we think it's really important to target home movers with low cost green mortgage extensions or incentives for heat pump readiness. In summary, we think there are huge opportunities, but also big behavioral challenges, and they go together. So when thinking about behavior change, we shouldn't just be focused on individual choice and lifestyle changes, but we want to build a world in which, even for the most disengaged citizens, low carbon behaviors are more attractive, easier, socially the norm, and timely. In short, the default choice.
Great, thanks, Andrew. We're going to have so much to discuss in the discussion, but let's get some more from Frank.
Thanks, Ed. Good afternoon, everyone. My primary interest is people's health, and my primary challenge is the quality of air that they breathe. Environmental air pollution is the biggest killer in the UK and across the world. It's not really appreciated because we don't see the pollution normally, we can't smell it. But it is having that impact on livelihoods. So what's the driver of poor air quality? As you all know, it's fossil fuel use. And what's fossil fuel use connected to? Greenhouse gas emissions. So the two are bedfellows. So climate change and poor air quality go together. So if you actually address one, you're addressing the other one. So most of us now live in cities, and most of our cities are badly congested. So if we can do something about improving the flow of movement, travel through our cities in a clean fashion, then we benefit both climate change and air quality for the people that live there. So how do we do that? And why do that? Well, in 2016, the transportation sector became the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the UK. It used to be the energy sector, but we've been very good at removing coal from our energy generation. So now in transportation, it's been pretty steady for the last 20, 30 years, and the amount of pollution and CO2 gas it emits, but it's sitting at 27% of all our emissions. So again, that's a very good reason to target it. But, you know, everybody loves their private vehicle. But if they knew that car journeys and taxi journeys represented 2/3 of all those CO2 emissions and most of the pollution, then it sort of gives you, you know, at least a platform to think about how you are moving about. But of course, we're talking about behavioral change here today, and it's very difficult to get people out of their cars, especially after the pandemic. You've seen the use of public transportation has gone down. We haven't got back to pre-pandemic levels yet. More people are in their cars, especially in the outer areas of the city. So we've got to be smart about how we do this, and we've got to spend some money. We've got to improve our public transport system even more, and we've got to bring in regulation, unfortunately, which discourages car use. And in due course, that's going to be road pricing. We're not there yet, but it will be coming. And that means that we can be really smart about how we control the movement of vehicles through the city. During rush hour, we can put the price up, so it's more expensive to travel. So that will nudge people to travel outside rush hour. We can also put extra pricing on larger polluting vehicles, big SUVs. Smaller cars will be cheaper to use. So that will be a nudge towards, less pollution, less CO2 emissions. So there are things that can be done. They cost money, but it's got to be sitting alongside education and incentives if it is going to work. So I see we have the solutions. Other cities have done it. Singapore's done it. Copenhagen's done it. London's doing a pretty good job, but it's an enormous city. There's 10 million people here. And we've traditionally got not a very good road system. But I think with a little bit of guidance, a little bit of reactive policy from a government which really believes in doing something about this and improving the health of their population, dealing with the climate change challenge, they're going to reap the benefits from the less health expenditure down the line for the next generation as well. So I'll stop there. I've got lots more to say, but I'll stop
Great.
there.
Well, hopefully we'll get back to you very soon. So we'll come to questions in a bit. We'll just have a bit more of a panel discussion here. Before we continue talking about the how, which a lot of you have raised, I just want to step back a bit to some of the politics of this with our two elected representatives. So, Philip, you're a Conservative Member of Parliament. Some of your colleagues have been a bit sceptical around the net zero stuff, and they see the behaviour change as maybe sort of almost beyond the pale and evidence that net zeros can be very tough. For example, Lord Frost commenting on the energy security strategy, saying that with wind power and not enough investment in backup, we're going to have rationing and behaviour change, and that people wouldn't put up with that. So do you think there's how do you address concerns like that some of your colleagues have, for example?
Well, I think there's very few colleagues who are in the old camp of climate change deniers. I don't think even Lord Frost would admit to that. So I think the argument politically is really a matter of pace and scale of investment, not about whether we need to do this or not. That argument has been won. But on pace and scale, that comes to choices about resources, which is what politics is all about when you're in government. And I think there it is legitimate to challenge questions. I think in relation to the energy security strategy, for me, the major big thing about that was the absolute commitment to baseload nuclear capacity, which is a decision that, with the exception of Hinkley Point, which was a decision made under the coalition government, it's been ducked for 25 years. We've all seen the decommissioning of the nuclear fleet coming at us fast down the track, and no successive governments have refused to take a decision about it. And that's what's going to give rise to a significant potential risk of lights going out as electricity demand grows as we decarbonize the economy. So the other aspects, the sort of, cheaper aspects of the energy security strategy, which were very welcome, were a huge increase in solar. And there's a big debate to be had about whether we use alternative land use from farming and turn it into solar, which I personally think would be a big mistake, or whether we use the existing infrastructure that is all around us, the buildings, the rooftops, many of which are southern facing and should all have PV on top of them. And the technology for solar PV is changing very rapidly. We're not far away from having a film that you can roll out across the roof. And it's not quite as efficient as the current types of PV that are available. And we're also going to have roof tiles. They exist at the moment, but they're again not yet quite as efficient, but the efficiency is improving all the time, where you tile a roof ab initio from construction with solar panel tiles. You won't have to add the tiles on later. So I think technology is going to help, will accelerate as companies sort of pick up the investment in things which consumers can then adapt and adopt. But to go back to your question about where the politics of this lies, I think it is about how do we stimulate behavior to change quickly enough to generate the demand to require the companies to bring forward the products that will help us get to where we need to go.
And is there any area of what the government's asking people to do on behaviour change that concern you, whether that's adopting electric vehicles, adopting heat pumps, or potentially down the line changing their diet?
Well, we're at pretty early stages in lots of these aspects. So each of the things you just mentioned, there are currently 200,000 electric vehicles on our roads. There are 39 million internal combustion vehicles on our roads, 32 million of which are cars. So that's a big change that's got to take place. There are, at the moment, I don't know what the number are for vegans or vegetarians on the planet. Somebody else might know the answer to that sort of thing. You might know. 2%. 2%, yeah. So it's even fewer. Our committee haven't really looked at either of those things. We have looked at energy efficiency of homes. There are 29 million residential homes across the UK, 19 million of which don't achieve energy performance certificate level C, which is, we were discussing before we started, is a very imprecise measurement of energy efficiency. It was designed to measure fuel poverty, but it's the proxy that is being used at the moment. The Committee on Climate Change had made a very bold assumption about what the average cost of getting an energy efficiency rating up to C, which was about £7,500 per property. Well, you can't buy a heat pump for £7,500. So I think that is a very, very bold statement that assumes that the cost of heat pumps will come down very radically. Our committee were of the opinion that it was closer to £20,000 to get the home ready on average, and that was evidence taken from the Northern Housing Consortium, which is a group of social housing providers, so typically smaller houses, many of which will have been built more recently than the average house in rural areas like my constituency, where the costs will be greater. But that was about £20,000 before you had the heat pump. Heat pump prices might come down to £5,000, currently about £9,000. So let's call it £25,000. Now that's a large amount of money for individuals to fund, and the way in which it will happen, I suspect, is when properties change hands and you don't have the disruption of trying to retrofitting the 19 million homes that need doing until such time as the property is vacant and the work can be done. But how that is funded is a matter that still requires work.
Okay, great. Andrew, I'll come to you in a second on that point around home changeovers, for example. But Marissa, just on some of the political issues at the local level, I guess sort of the front line of net zero politics at the local level has been cycle lanes, low traffic neighbourhoods. You mentioned all the other work that you're doing, and I guess e-bikes is one that would benefit from those cycle lanes. Where do you see the challenges at the political level, at the local level, around behaviour change?
I think they're quite similar in that there's still a nervousness about being seen as dictating or telling people what to do. I mean, I met a cabinet member a government cabinet member on Friday. He said, we haven't told people how to travel and we won't tell them what to eat. That's not what we're here to do. But actually, I think we've got to be a bit bolder in that, because we don't want to dictate, and this isn't black and white. And when we talk about 2% vegans, I'm very pragmatic. I'm not suggesting everyone should go vegan, but I am suggesting they need to cut down their milk, meat and dairy, for example, and we need to find better ways of producing the meat and dairy that is in existence, encouraging people to take up more plant-based foods. And we need to be clear and set a level playing field for that. So, for example, there's different areas where government will openly sort of promote meat and dairy, but won't give the same level playing field to other forms of food production. School milk scheme, for example, doesn't encompass plant-based milks in it. So those sort of things we need to be a bit bolder and facilitate consumers seeing that government are supporting this kind of thing. And it doesn't have to be at the detriment of another industry. We can still support farmers who are producing livestock and meat and dairy, whilst also fairly supporting that other sector. So I think the government needs to be bolder across the space. And at the county level, there's this same nervousness. So, when I started doing the climate change delivery plan, I was very bold on what I thought elected members should do, and I got a real pushback from it. We're not prepared to do that. We don't want to do car shares. We don't want to change what we eat at the county council. We don't want to, do other things to our properties and stuff like that. It's none of your business, Marissa, they're sort of saying to me, to tell us how to live. And I'm saying it is absolutely not my business to tell anyone how to live, but we do need to lead by example, and we do need to be clear on what we're saying to people so they understand the things that need to change. So I think there's lots of things we can do. At the County Council, we're putting millions of pounds into electric buses ourselves in order to provide the capability for people to be able to change and do things. So when we say to them, don't use your car, we're not just saying it into an empty room without giving a solution, because that's the worst thing we can do. And I think that these issues are incredibly complex. So government at any level needs to be very careful in what it sort of goes out telling people to do, unless it's thought it through. Food alone is a really complex thing, and how to get sustainable, good, healthy, nutritious food. It's not as simple as just saying this or that. So we have to be sure that we've got those kind of things in place. Have we got the electric bikes in place? Are they affordable? Have we got public transport in place that people can use? Again, is it affordable? If we're asking people to buy local food, can they afford it? Is it accessible for them? All of those sorts of things. So we have to be a bit careful when we go into the space of telling people what to do if we haven't provided some answers as well.
Great. Frank, I just want to come to you on your experience in London. We've had successive administrations that have done stuff on air quality, from Ken Livingstone, Boris Johnson, and now Sadiq Khan. Do you think that things have been easier for those mayors to implement those sort of policies, or do you think the backlash has been fiercer? And then what does that tell us about road pricing, for example?
So, I mean, starting off with the congestion charging in 2003, there was an enormous hoo-ha when it was coming in. And after it did come in and there was an improvement in congestion in the city, suddenly all the rhetoric went away. And, you know, we had faster car journeys, we had better air quality for a while. And then, unfortunately, everything went back to normal again. But at the time, it was thought that we should never do this, but it actually was a good thing to do. And then as we move forward with the other schemes, there's always been some kickback, but in reality, the benefits are there, they're measurable. You can see it in improvement in air quality. And we have a plan to ensure that, you know, London is going to end up as being one of the major cities in the world with pretty good air quality. So I think you've got to expect that there is a lack of understanding in some parts. There's definitely on the commercial side, there's always more costs, so that's going to be difficult. So you do need to support it with incentivization schemes. But ultimately, if you're doing it for the right reason, and that is for the people that you represent, then I think after it's been implemented, then, you know, people will see the benefit.
And are you seeing potential for that for the success in London to be replicated in other cities in the UK in the discussions that you have?
Well, the other cities in the UK were requested by government to bring in their clean air zones, and some of them have, some of them haven't, and some of them say they don't need it anymore. So we're in a really strange situation where central government has sort of put the challenge out to those cities to deal with the air quality problems they have. Some of them say they don't have enough money to do it properly. Others are really embracing it. So it's a mixed model at the moment. But again, I think some of the cities have done it very well because they've gone through the education process of why we have to do this, what the benefits will be. And yes, there will be a bit of pain, but down the line we'll see a lot of benefit. So I think that's really important. That's what Melissa was saying. I mean, we can't ask people to change their behaviors without them understanding why we want them to do it. And we should also lead. Right. So our public services should be leading in decarbonizing everything they do. And then, at least it can't be said, well, you're not doing it and you're asking us to do it.
Okay, great. Just before we come to the audience, come to Andrew. You were talking earlier, you gave some good examples there. I think it'd be interesting if you could expand maybe on one or two of the examples of where you think the greatest potential is for behaviour change and government nudges, for example, to actually reduce emissions.
Yeah, so I think the main message from my introductory remarks is that behavior change and the other things the government needs to do are complements, not substitutes. On heat pumps, I just wanted to sort of follow up on a few of the things Philip said, because I think Philip made a lot of good points. So first, before I get into it, I just want to talk about why heat pumps are so important, because I think sometimes that's sort of assumed knowledge, and apologies if this is too sort of like heat pumps 101. But heat pumps, in a way, are a miraculous technology. The best gas boiler turns gas into heat with like 80, 90% efficiency. That's amazing. You know, you take gas and turn 90% of the energy into heat. That's really amazing. Heat pumps do a lot better. They take the energy from electricity, turn it into heat at 200 to 400% efficiency. It sounds like something that's almost physically impossible, but they're taking unit of energy and turning it into 3 units of heat. And they do that through, you know, like basically a nifty trick of not just creating the heat, but drawing the heat from outside. They can do that even on cold days. And the fact that they're turning that little bit of energy into so much heat is really important, because it means that when we scale up the amount of heat pumps, we're not only reducing the amount of gas that is required because we're electrifying the heat, but we're reducing the total amount of energy that's required, because the system has gotten so much more efficient, maybe 2 to 4 times as efficient. And that efficiency means that there's actually a bit of controversy regarding just how efficient you need to make the rest of the home to be heat pump ready. It's important that the home isn't leaking heat when you put in a heat pump, especially because heat pumps provide the radiators with slightly less hot liquid. But the fact that you've given that system so much efficiency by switching the gas boiler to a heat pump should be a finger on the scale when you're assessing sort of like apples to apples, heat pump system versus gas boiler system. In terms of ideas that we have, one idea that we're really excited about is trying to get boiler installers to be evangelists for heat pumps. Marissa had her gas boiler fail 2 weeks ago. The installer came, didn't even suggest heat pumps. So we think installers of gas boilers, who will coincidentally be mostly the installers of heat pumps, they should be knowledgeable about heat pumps and excited about heat pumps. We think a government program to sort of enable gas boiler installers to have heat pumps first. It's a very exciting idea because they're a really influential gatekeeper. The last thing I'll say is that status quo bias is like a very important element of public policy. And I think sort of Frank's alluded to it. Sometimes you have these congestion charging schemes that are unpopular before they're implemented. Then when they're implemented, people see the benefits and they become popular. So it's sort of on politicians to be bold. Sometimes the things that seem scary right now from a public acceptance point of view will be popular once people can see the benefits.
Great. Philip, you want to come in?
Well, just to build up very briefly on the point you were making there, Andrew, which I think is completely valid about heat pumps versus gas boilers. One of the reasons why the Green Homes Grant Scheme was such a shambles was because there were very few people equipped to install heat pumps. There were, when we did some work on this in our inquiry and then in the subsequent inquiry into green jobs, there were, there were about 1,200 companies which were accredited under the acceptable accreditation through which the government's Green Homes Grant Scheme is meant to be implemented to install across the country. That compares with over 100,000 companies accredited to do gas boiler installations. And the people who do it, the boilers are done by plumbers, the heat pumps are done by electricians. So you need a completely different skill set to install a heat pump. And that's why most gas boiler installers who might be bidding for your piece of work, are not actually able to do it because they haven't got the skills. So it requires a very significant, I think, intervention by government to assist in this transition in order to allow that implementation to take place.
Great, thank you. I'll just take some questions from the audience. We've got one that's come in over the Zoom, and I'll take another couple as well from the audience here. So this one was for Marissa, talking about the role of local nature supporting environmentalism and what more can be done to encourage people to take up nature-based volunteering like planting trees and rewilding. But I'll just take another one. Yes, gentleman here.
Jim Clark from Zurich Insurance. We've been talking today a lot about some of the changes we need to make to the built environment, whether that's heat pumps, energy efficiency, EV charging, and solar panels, and all sorts of things. We talked a little bit about skills there. Is there a concern from the panel about how well trained our construction and building industry is for all of these things? We have some concerns about some of these transitions, while laudable on sustainability aims, could increase other risks such as fire.
Great. Can I just take the one behind?
Thanks. Thanks for a great discussion. My question is on finance, because particularly on green homes, we're going to need so much more public, private, and blended finance in order to make the changes. I'm keen to hear what the panelists think the best thing the government could do in the near term, and how we can make a politically compelling case, kind of noting, as Ed mentioned, it's not always about the policy, also the politics, and recognising that Treasury hasn't always been so keen to invest more in these schemes. Thanks.
Great. So 3 questions there, one on green volunteering, one on skills, and one on green finance and how to make that compelling within government and wider. Who wants to come in on those, and preferably with a behaviour change element to those answers as well? Philip, yes.
Can I do the last 2?
Yes, so on, skills and finance.
On fire risk in buildings, the biggest source of fires in buildings are kitchen fires, primarily from gas systems used to cook with. If you move to an decarbonised electrical cooking system and heating system, I suspect you will reduce fire risk. Although I accept that there is a huge challenge in getting the construction industry into shape to be able to undertake this work. Your question just went out of my head. I'm sorry, I was about to address that. Finance.
How to make
right. So in my constituency, I've had 1 passive house development completed by the social housing provider. And I went a year in, I went to visit the tenants living in the houses to ask them what the experience was like. Those passive houses, built to a passive house standard, cost 30% more to build than the conventional house. The cost to the tenant of heating the property was 1/10. So they were literally paying £10 a month, as opposed to this was before the energy crisis, as opposed to £100 a month. So there is an arbitrage there. There's a challenge between how you transition that between the developer and the tenant or the owner occupier. But there is an opportunity for intelligent financial brains, which we've got lots in this country, to be able to make that affordable.
Great. Frank, I just want to come to you there on what Philip mentioned about gas stoves, because that clearly has air pollution impacts as well. I mean, is that something you've been looking at, how we can get people onto induction, for example?
Yeah, I mean, it's all part of the plan, isn't it? The transition to zero, getting rid of gas, and that means that people will need to move to electric. And from an air quality point of view, that is absolutely fantastic, because you would not believe the amount of particulate and NO2, these are the 2 major pollutants which impact our health, that you have in your kitchen if you cook by gas. And we've done studies with school children where we're really worried about what they're breathing on their way to school and the way back from school on a busy road. And then they go home, and the monitor which we've given them goes through the roof. So they're getting a lot more exposure at home than they are even on the school route, which we know is bad. So that's, again, all part of this education, just letting people understand that if they do cook with gas at the moment, they've got to use their extractor fan, or they've got to open a window, because you can't see this stuff, and we know it's harmful. But the replacement of gas stoves over the next couple of decades is going to be a fantastic health benefit.
Okay, it sounds like something there where low-cost monitoring as well is sort of helping things there as well in terms of finding that problem.
Absolutely, it's showing that the problem exists. Now, we won't do that in every home, but we know if the home's got a gas cooker and they don't use good ventilation, then they've got the problem.
Andrew, have you done any work on gas stoves, for example? Because it's quite a third rail issue. It's sort of the low traffic neighbourhood of the home, really.
Yeah, we haven't done work directly on it, but we are excited about ideas to make people receptive to electric cooking. I've seen some wonderful YouTube and TikTok videos by influential chefs showing how they use electric cooking, and some talking about how they prefer it. I think that's important, because you can get a situation like you have with EVs, where if we could persuade people that electric cooking was actually superior, that was sort of the premium way to cook, I think that would be really positive.
Okay, great. I just want to come to you on the green volunteering one, or you can come in on the other ones as well.
So, I mean, first of all, we have lots of schemes going on. So we look at taking young people out of colleges and schools and trying to connect our countryside into those green skills things we just spoke about. So just as an example, we've got an old sawmill that we've now created into a kind of wood hub where we can teach wood skills and things like that, which is something that's we're seeing sort of less and less people doing this kind of thing. We've got community groups of vulnerable people in our community, disabled people are out working on our land, doing things. I saw them last week on the Airbnb. We had Lord Benyon, in fact, come and visit them, and he was very impressed by what they're doing. We work with the justice system, which I think, you know, there's nothing like the old digging a ditch kind of thing to get people out of their heads when they're going through difficult times and things. We work to actively bring them into our countryside, and we're doing social prescribing. So we're now working with the health service to say, mental health problems, let's tackle them by using our countryside and get people out to use them. But most importantly, it's about making sure that our residents know that the countryside belongs to them, because it does. It's you know, our common land and things like that. So they've all got some ownership to them. So we're allowing them to come and explore that kind of ownership. And what's quite an interesting thing we've been doing is we're running this scheme as a behaviour change scheme, and it's called iDoct. I do one thing, and it's a really simplistic tool which lists sort of 10 things. It can have more, but we've contained it to 10 things that people can do in their own gardens or their own land and things that's connected to nature, which is some really simple stuff, which just gets them thinking about things. And that, in a way, sort of then builds up the relationship with the countryside. So people in very urban parts of Surrey, and they do exist, we have some really high density council estates in my own division, in fact, where there's barely a scrap of green land. It's about getting them to recognise that they can be connected to nature. And I think when you do that, you'll get more volunteering. They just need to know about it and feel like they're welcome and involved. So I'm really optimistic, actually. I think that COVID also showed a huge jump in people volunteering and coming forward. I think we've got lots of people who want to do these stuff, and I think it's really positive in that area.
Great, thank you. Let's take a few more questions from the room. Yes, gentleman there.
Hi, Chris McKeon from the Press Association. I wanted to follow on something that Philip mentioned about installing heat pumps and the costs of that. Essentially, how do you encourage landlords to change their behaviour? Because they know that their property is going to be let regardless because there's a housing crisis, and they don't see the benefit of reduced bills. So how do you get at them? Is this kind of, you know, nudging enough, or do you have to at some point start shopping?
Okay, I think most people here will probably want to come in on that. So why don't we take that as a question? Philip, do you want to?
Okay, so we've already got legislation for private rental sector where landlords have to get to EPCC in order to let new leases. So the legislation has changed a lot of behaviour already. I happen to think that there's still a problem there because the EPC system is so slow to adapt new technology. So, for example, we just had in the energy security statement a commitment by the government to reduce to zero VAT on energy efficiency improvements, which is a great help. That takes 20% off the cost of these installations. But it doesn't apply to battery storage. So what will happen, the advances in battery technology are happening very rapidly at the moment. And although there's a lot of demand for batteries for the electric vehicles that Frank's been talking about, there's going to be an enormous upsurge in demand for battery storage to take the energy that we're generating from the solar panels on our roofs to be able to use ourselves rather than sell back into the grid at very low values. And that, I think, is going to be a big behavioural shift, because it'll be in the interest of whoever owns the solar panels, which in most cases will be the householder, in some cases might be the landlord if they've installed it in social housing or potentially in private rented housing, and it'll be in their financial interest to invest in a battery as well. So that needs to be brought within the EPC rating system, and I've just called on the government in the chamber last week, on the Energy Secretary, to try and get that zero rated for VAT as well. I think there are things that can be done with a bit of imagination by government to make this easier.
Okay, Andrew, do you want to comment on this landlords or even a broader homeowners point there?
I think it's a good point that the landlord's issue is hard because of the misaligned incentives between the landlord and the tenant. I think the Behavioural Insights team for a long time now has advocated that listings companies and platforms list the warm rent of homes. So not just the rent, but also the rent plus utilities as the headline figure that people search for their next home. They could see the warm rent. So that helps align incentives between landlords and tenants in terms of the utility bills. That said, with heat pumps, it's an extra challenge because heat pumps don't necessarily reduce the utility bills. Although that may change, heat pumps are getting more and more efficient. and gas prices and electricity prices may sort of like diverge to the point where heat pumps do mean that tenants are spending less.
£600 a year cheaper this weekend's articles.
Nice. That's good news.
That's after the change in energy prices.
And it depends on the heat pump's efficiency, which is also changing, in a good way, for positive direction for heat pumps. That's it. I think there are little nudges that can help. So for example, if property listing sites showed the homes that were low carbon, and if people wanted to search for that, that would again be like a double nudge, making renters interested in those homes, but also making landlords interested potentially in putting in the investment so that their homes showed up as the low carbon homes. That said, to be candid, I think some shoving is important too.
Great. Marissa.
Yeah, as was mentioned, there's legislation, but there's a need for it to be enforced, obviously, and I think the councils have the responsibility to check up on that. So we're looking at the county council at how we can work through an educational campaign with tenants to basically say to them, is your landlord meeting these requirements? You have a right to push them. But we're also looking, because we've recognised the private rented sector is very much linked in Surrey to energy poverty, we're also looking at very low interest loans that we can facilitate for landlords to be able to put in these kind of measures and things and upgrade their homes. So we're quite active at the council level as to how we address this.
Okay, great.
Well, I was just going to say a slightly different worry I have is with the energy crisis. I mean, people will not be able to afford to heat their homes the traditional way, and they'll start to use waste, wood, all of which will, lead to further indoor air quality problems. I see that as being a real problem over the next couple of years, and it's all going to be unseen, and we won't be aware of it.
Yeah, I have seen people posting on articles saying, well, I can't afford the oil boiler anymore, so I'm going to be running the fire every night and just staying in one room. Okay, are there any more questions in the room? I think there was one just here. Is that? Yeah, this chap here then.
So slightly related to that point, so I think there's some great ideas here around the road tax variable usage, and I can't remember the exact term, but it was timed energy usage, right? And then it's reasonable to suggest that there are some people in society who are going to be better able to flex their behaviour in an advantageous cost-saving way than others. I mean, is that a problem? How do you address that?
Okay, are there any more questions in the room? Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Penny Hampton from Save the Children. We sort of alluded to the cost of living crisis, so that's actually changing the behaviours of children and families, particularly those on the lowest incomes. I just wonder what your take in terms of the panel is on how that actually has changed the politics of all of these sort of net zero questions over the last 6 months or so.
Okay. Philip, do you want to take that one on the politics of net zero?
Yes, if I may, just on the point that you were making about vulnerable people missing out. I think the introduction of technology, I come back to the technology point, and the smart metering is, the take-up of smart metering in electricity terms hasn't been as great as we would like it should have been, but we're getting increasingly sophisticated metering technologies, which will allow people who are interested to be able to reduce their cost of energy by, again, if you have a storage facility, you can buy it at a low time of the day and sell it back at a high time. And that is happening for consumers right now. But the kind of consumers who are going to be able to take advantage of that are people like those people in this room, rather than our grandparents, who probably won't have the aptitude. So there is a problem about sort of equity and fairness across the community. And that comes back to your point about cost of living and net zero. And I think that's where there is a big impetus on social housing providers, which are government funded, to be able to adopt some of these measures quicker than householders. And we are seeing that. So when the Green Homes Grant Scheme for householders was terminated a year ago, practically last month, much of the money that hasn't been sent to individual householders has gone to local authorities to introduce further uptake of social housing. And I think that's probably the fair and the right thing to do.
It's probably a good time just to plug Onward's recent report that was published today called Taking the Temperature, which polled people for their opinions on net zero. And actually, surprisingly, in some ways, even though energy prices have been going up, people are seeing renewables and efficiency as part of the solution to that, rather than as the cause, as some people would like to have us believe. Just on that people who can't change their behaviour, Frank, I want to come to you on that, because that is an issue that's levelled at things like congestion charging, is that you're hammering people who have to drive for work. So what is the right response to that?
Well, that have to drive to work, that is an interesting statement, because, you know, we could all take public transport to work. It may take us twice as long. If we need to carry heavy equipment and we need to drive a van, then of course that's absolutely fine. If we're a delivery driver, that's different. But 2/3 of the emissions come from private car drivers and taxis across the UK, and it's more so in cities. And we have data out there from these surveys that a lot of journeys can be walked under, you know, in 20 minutes. You don't need to do it. And if you're going for your weekly supermarket shop, yeah, of course you need to do it. But there's many other journeys which don't involve the requirement of the car. And if we could just, if we could explain to people in a way which they understood what they were doing in respect of emissions and poor air quality, they didn't need to spend the money on the fuel, and they actually getting exercise, which is benefiting their health. So active travel is a really untapped component of all of this. And I think people, if they understand all the benefits versus the disbenefits, we need to do a better job at telling them. When we had a tobacco crisis and we went through all that, fighting with tobacco companies, with the advertising and explaining to people, we were able to change the situation. In the UK at the moment, air pollution is our big tobacco problem, but we're not telling people about it, other than, you know, the informed few.
Okay, I have about 30 seconds for each of our two remaining panelists.
Really quickly, to not sink back into old habits. And I know Jacob Rees-Mogg probably has a point in wanting civil servants to be back at their desk, but working from home is a more equal access thing for a lot of our employers at Surrey. I mean, some of them it takes 2.5 hours to get into the county council because there aren't the public transport networks. So I'm not saying to my team, I want you at the desk. I'm saying to my team, I want results. I don't care where you do it. All I care about is the results, and we have to take that view and not get people coming into work, basically, if they can. There's times when they do, I acknowledge that, they need to be in together, but that flexible working remains important, and I don't think we should go back to pre-2020.
Okay, 30 seconds.
The thing I'll say is that demand side response, so people turning off their electricity and on for the heavy hitting appliances when it's optimal for the grid, it's really important to allow the grid to be powered by renewable energy, some of which is variable in terms of when it comes on and off. That's why we think time of use tariffs should be the default. But like defaults, we think if it doesn't work for you because you need electricity and don't want to be responsive to pricing, then you could opt out of it. The final thing I'll say, though, is I don't think we should assume that time of use tariffs is only beneficial for the well-off consumers. There may be consumers that have very large homes that are in fuel poverty that could actually reduce their bills a lot by being on a time of use tariff through one way or another. We did a trial a few years ago where we found that the homes that did the best from a sort of time of use tariff were the ones who had invested the least in energy efficiency. So we're talking about some of these homes that there's a correlation there with fuel poverty that might actually do well from time of use tariffs. So sort of like an interesting unpredictability to the way some of these issues cut.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. We are out of time. It just leaves me to thank our speakers, thank Imperial College London for sponsoring this event, and thank our audience for joining both in person and online. If you missed any of this event, you can watch it back on Onward's YouTube channel. And to find future Onward events, please sign up for our newsletter and follow us on social media, and we'll see you next time.